looking at the audience on our wintry evening, thank you to all the students and faculty who came out, but apparently there are about 100 people who are going to be watching this, not live, but later. So to those watching it later, good evening, and welcome to the Center for the Restoration of Culture at Thomas More College and this evening's lecture as we come out of our COVID despair and winter. We thought a talk on despair and indifference would be just the thing to warm us up. So I'm very happy. For those of you watching, I'm President William Fahey. To everyone else, you know me. I'm very happy finally to welcome Alexander O'Hara to our campus. We have been trying, according to my email log, since just before COVID, to arrange some sort of visit. And I don't know if you're going to tell a story about finding out about Thomas More College, but part of the story of Dr. O'Hara coming here has to do with those who preceded all of you, students and faculty in Ireland, who said good things about strange Americans, especially in New England at Thomas More College. So Dr. O'Hara and I have actually been missing one another most of our lives. So we've gone to similar institutions and we've been converging in time. So Dr. O'Hara is from Ireland, from Galway, which is where my family's from. He went to St. Andrews. So we have 4 faculty here that went to St. Andrews. More the time of the Kitzingers. I had already left. I think you were just a little boy, in fact, when I left St. Andrews. But Dr. O'Hara studied in St. Andrews in originally medieval history, and then went on to Oxford for his master's in medieval studies, historical methodology, and realized the Scottish university system is superior, and so he returned to St. Andrews. But most of his books seem to be published with Oxford, so there's nothing too bad, too shabby about Oxford. Dr. O'Hara, I knew I would like because he's one of the few people that uses an expression dear to me, late antiquity. Most people would call this the early Middle Ages, but there's a small group of scholars who are fascinated in the birth of Christianity, the fall of the Roman Empire, the beginning of the Middle Ages. And his scholarly background is principally that. And principally, at least in its early years, the contribution that the Irish monks made to the formation of Christian civilization and the European identity. So my heart thrills when I hear about St. Columbanus and Jonas of Bobbio and other authors that Dr. O'Hara has worked on. But I was very excited to learn this evening that in addition to rather deep, detailed scholarship, he has, in some respects, in my view, been modeling his own life on the very people he's studied. I don't know with intention or not. So you might want to consider this, students, what happens if you fall in love with authors and texts. So the classic Irish saint loves his country very much, but for various reasons goes into exile and achieves more by praying for his country than he can achieve when he's in his own country, and ends up in an interesting network of friends in distant places. And if you look at Dr. O'Hara's CV, you find a man who's been in Austria, who's come to the United States, who's been traveling around back and forth, sometimes returning to Ireland, and now finally getting a chance to do some very interesting, important work for the Catholic Church in Ireland with their catechetical program. So you're the executive secretary or equivalent of the director, national director of catechism for all of Ireland. In addition to this, which is no small task, this year he is he's a visiting scholar and a Fulbright Fellow at Harvard University in their Department of Celtic Languages and Literature. But as you can see, we're being treated to Dr. O'Hara's love of Christian culture and broader themes. So just so everyone's clear, we're privileged to hear him exploring with us something that's not his undergraduate or graduate area of specialization or where he spends most of his scholarly time, but his explorations and the results of his thoughts from teaching. So tonight we're hearing about two very interesting artists. I know that some people here love one or the other artist, Hieronymus Bosch and Pieter Bruegel. And their, as he calls it, their theologies of despair and indifference. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Dr. O'Hara.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for braving the elements this evening. It's actually a very Brueghelian evening. Some of you may know The Hunters in the Snow, one of probably Brueghel's most famous paintings now in Vienna. But I want to start this talk, first of all, to thank President Fahey for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure and privilege for me to come to Thomas More and to spend time with you. This is an area outside of my usual scholarly activities. I should maybe give a little bit of context as to why I chose this theme. So the first book I read on the Middle Ages was Johann Hausinger's The Waning of the Middle Ages when I was an undergraduate at St. Andrews. And Hausinger's book, it really looks at the 15th century, but through the work of Jan van Eyck, this great Flemish artist of the 15th century, really looking at the Flemish artists as a kind of a part of their zeitgeist in terms of the end of the Middle Ages. And but on a personal level, I've had a fascination, I would say, with Bruegel since I was a young child. Growing up in Dublin, for some reason my father had a very bloody image of the crucifixion in our tiny little hallway by Fra Angelico with St. Dominic at the foot of the cross. And as a child, walking down this narrow corridor, usually at night when I needed to use the restroom, this crucifixion would strike me with terror as I tried to make my way past it. As a child, of course, everything looks much bigger than it actually is. But on the opposite side of Fra Angelico's crucifixion were two wonderful prints of Bruegel, the Peasant's Wedding, this very festive scene of a marriage, peasant marriage, and then the Hunters in the Snow, this group of hunters returning tired after a day's hunting. So these were prints that my father had, I think, got in Vienna, and as a young boy, these were just a wonderful, I suppose, my first introduction to religious art and to art as a young boy. So the paintings of the Flemish masters Hieronymus Bosch and Pieter Bruegel the Elder bridge both the late Middle Ages and the Northern Renaissance and the confessional fault lines of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. So this is Hieronymus Bosch on the left, and we think it's a self-portrait of Pieter Bruegel the Elder on the right. Bosch was a Catholic artist born in around 1450 in 's-Hertogenbosch, part of the Duchy of Brabant, then under the control of the Dukes of Burgundy. He was a member of the Brotherhood of Our Lady, a wealthy fraternity comprising both lay and religious men and women in his hometown, centered on a miracle-working image of the Virgin. And his patrons comprised both religious institutions and members of the Burgundian court circle in Brussels. He died in 1516, a year before Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. Brueghel was born 10 years later, around 526, around the city of Breda, also in Brabant. So this is showing the modern regions of the Netherlands. So this is really the area here we're talking about, North Brabant, see 's-Hertogenbosch and Breda here, in the south of the Netherlands. By 1551, Brueghel had entered the Antwerp Painters Guild, and following 2 years travelling in Italy, returned to Antwerp, which subsequently became his base. His patrons were the wealthy merchant class of Antwerp. Brueghel was a Catholic with possible Protestant sympathies who moved in humanist circles. He died in Brussels in 1569. The Burgundian Netherlands passed to the Spanish Habsburgs in 1556. This is the most powerful man at this time, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the empire in which the sun never set. He was actually born in Ghent, in Flanders. Now, Brueghel lived through a turbulent and violent period when the Habsburgs exerted absolute rule in the Netherlands while violently suppressing heresy. If Bosch can be seen as the last great painter of the Middle Ages, then Brueghel is the first truly modern and secular artist. None of his works were painted for the church. While Brueghel was clearly influenced by Bosch, his art is informed by the ideals of humanism and the Renaissance. Both are incomparable artists of mimetic, desire, and contagion. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Of showing what happens when human desire is not focused on God. In what can be termed their theologies of despair, both artists' pessimistic view of humankind reveal the seismic cultural and theological rifts of their time. There is very little that's redemptive about the work of both artists. Bosch is essentially an infernal artist, while Brueghel is the artist of indifference. Both were moralists in their own ways. While Bosch's religious art is explicit, Brueghel's is a lot subtler. His is a hidden theology. But both share common themes. So what I want to do this evening is focus on select works of both artists to illustrate and further explore their theological themes. St. Augustine viewed human life on earth as a pilgrimage through time towards the Christian's true homeland of heaven, which was informed by Saint Paul's advice to live as strangers on earth. Now in the Prado, Madrid, Bosch's The Peddler from 1500, around 1500, shows a nervous-looking man, a wayfarer representing every man, a common medieval theme, passing through a landscape beset with traps and danger. He walks the narrow path of life and is about to cross a rickety bridge. Above his head in the distance stands a gallows with a crowd already gathered for the execution. They are waiting the condemned. To his left, another peddler has been beset by bandits who steal his belongings and tie him to a tree. The wayfarer turns his head to fend off an angry dog with his staff, but does not see the crack in the bridge ahead of him. In the near distance, a couple dance to a piper who sits beneath a wayside crucifix. So here, it's the crack in the bridge there. As Joseph Kerner comments, the energy of future life, or eros, contends with death, thanatos, lurking grimly behind. Meanwhile, just ahead of the peddler, a stone footbridge evidences an ominous crack that starts just below where the dancing couple's hands meet, signaling unseen hazards yet to come. The man is a vagrant, an outcast, and in Bosch's time in Northern Europe, new stricter laws could punish vagrancy by death. The gallows stand ready for him and for us. peddler is painted on the closed panel of a triptych, which when opened reveals the bigger picture. The hay wain, a history of sin from its earliest beginnings to its end. The left panel here shows the expulsion of the rebel angels from heaven, with God enthroned in the clouds, the creation of Eve from Adam's body, the temptation in the garden, with the snake having the same face as Eve, and the expulsion from paradise. The central panel shows a procession in motion with the multitude of humanity gathered around and following a large wagon of hay. The Pope, Alexander VI, the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France. So shown here, that's the infamous Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France there. They're riding nonchalantly behind the cart, while the crowd ahead of them become grasping and violent as they try to snatch hay for themselves. A man is crushed beneath the cartwheel, while another man slits another's throat. Gluttonous monks and avaricious nuns are seen in the bottom right. Above the hay and the fray, as it were, sit a young couple soon to give way to the sin of lust. A vast, fantastical landscape stretches into the far distance, with Christ looking down from the clouds, somewhat removed, almost shrugging his shoulders. Hay is symbolic for the vanity of human life, of worldliness, and echoes Isaiah 46, all flesh is grass. What no one seems to notice is that the hay cart is being pulled by demons straight into hell, shown in the right panel, where the hunters now become the hunted, as demonic-looking beasts skewer and hunt humans. Bosch tries to encompass all of human history into this symbolic tableau, but it ultimately originates in Eve's temptation of Adam. Bosch traces the origins of evil back to a time before the fall. Linking the old enemy to Eve, the artist implies that she, in league with a corruption as old as the creation, caused our undoing. This cosmic misogynistic theodicy also informs and deforms Bosch's most elusive work, where everything hinges on the calamitous instance of Adam's first glimpse of Eve. Bosch's most famous work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, from 1504, has been called the most elusive artwork ever made. Now also in the Prado in Madrid, it was commissioned by either Count Engelbert II of Nassau, a childless womanizer, or his nephew Count Henry III of Nassau for the Great Gallery of the Palace of Nassau in Brussels. The closed panel shown here shows God the Father in his own bubble in the far left, so up here. Creating the world, the third day of creation, when God commanded that the earth produce seed-bearing plants and trees that bear fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. A quote from Psalm 33, "For he spoke and it came to be, he commanded and it stood firm," is written across the top of the panel. Dark clouds threaten the fragile creation below. As Kerner notes, on the third day of creation, God separated earth from water, and it was sometimes held that in this division, good and evil were also separated, and that Lucifer and his prideful minions were on that day thrust out of heaven. The viewer beholds the earth from the divine standpoint and from the perspective of Psalm 33. From heaven the Lord looks down and sees all mankind. From his dwelling place he watches all who live on earth. Simultaneously inside and outside the world sphere, this unique world picture combines the medieval theocentric model of being as ens creatum, made by a personal creator God, with the modern anthropocentric technique of linear perspective. And when the triptych is opened, the viewer enters creation. The left panel is reminiscent of the luscious green backgrounds of Lucas Cranach the Elder, Paradise teems with verdant vegetation and animals. In the middle ground, the roseate fountain of life pours into a pool from which animals drink. In the foreground, God is Christ, the Logos, looking directly at the viewer, presents Eve to Adam, who blushes with desire at his first sight of Eve, who averts her eyes from his gaze. Bosch was fascinated by vision and sight lines. So if we follow Adam's sight line through the triptych, it leads us to the monstrous tree man in hell, who looks back via his ruined body and the pleasures that ruined him back to Adam, whose facial features he shares. So if we follow this sight line from Adam, it leads to this rather bizarre tree man with the same face as Adam. The sight line also extends through the central panel, an orgiastic panoply of copulating couples, but this time it is not God who holds Eve's wrist, but another Adam. In tandem with the adjacent couple embracing the seed pod, this pair enacts carnal desire's next step, when one created being reaches for another in order to seed the species. There are no children in this pleasure garden, but rather the perversion of God's plan for humankind, a false paradise whose transient beauty leads men to ruin and damnation, a motif common in medieval literature. The central panel shows the never-ending circle of Dionysiac mimetic desire. Citing a saying of Heraclitus that Dionysus is the same thing as Hades, the French social theorist René Girard commented that Dionysus is the same thing as hell, the same thing as Satan, the same thing as death, the same thing as the lynch mob. Dionysus is the destructiveness at the heart of violent contagion. So René Girard is best known for his theory of mimetic desire, which is essentially, we're all familiar with that. It's how particularly social media operates, and really that our desires are mediated through a model. And so whatever the object of that is, you or me, often our desires are modeled through a model. And this is what he calls mimetic desire. So an example would be doing a triathlon. You might have a friend who's training for a triathlon, and then you want to do a triathlon as well. But the problem with this is that this can lead to rivalry, so you get an escalation of rivalry, and that leads to violence. And then in terms of scapegoating is a mechanism through which this kind of violent contagion is redirected to an outsider in some way, or a scapegoat. And Girard really says that, in a way, that if you think in terms of pagan myths, and that it's often they blame the outsider. So the beggar who's the cause of the plague, we kill the beggar and the plague goes away. But he says that really with the Bible and with the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's the first case where the side of the victim is actually taken. So if we think of Joseph and his brothers, the Bible sides with the victim, and then through Christ's sacrifice, by not returning violence, Christ becoming the scapegoat, that in a way this breaks this demonic cycle of contagion, which is unconscious. Essentially, that's what Girard's theory is, in a way that through the crucifixion breaks this cycle of mimetic contagion. And so he was very concerned in a way that with the decline in Christianity, we're seeing more kind of return to kind of, in a way, escalation of mimetic violence, and the kind of the dangers that this poses. Okay, so how does this really apply to Bosch and Brueghel? So Girard really talks about, in terms of kind of, essentially mimetic desire is diabolical, and it's also it's never ending. It's a cycle. And this circle of mimetic desire is shown in the middle ground of the panel shown here, as women emerge from a pool, the pool of Venus, while men encircle them counterclockwise, which is symbolic of demonic or diabolical, all riding virile animal mounts. Now, in his commentaries on the Psalms, St. Augustine wrote, "The ungodly walk in a circle round about, that is, in the desire of things temporal, that revolve as a wheel, and therefore they do not arrive at eternity." The enactment of this mimetic desire is shown in the foreground of the panel, with couples fornicating and frolicking, so shown here, in empty husks of shells and in their own bubbles of desire. Two owls on either side, upper left and right, intimate the diabolical nature of what is going on. Owls are always bad in Bosch. And Adam and Eve peer out at us mournfully from their cave at the bottom right. Adam and Eve here. So this is a tableau of humanity turned in on itself, of a worshipping of the self as idolatry, and as such is remarkably contemporary in its relevance. And as Joseph Kerner explains, the sin of sodomy, of a fruitless sexual act, is hinted at throughout the central panel. Fornication is well underway in the dark hole partly submerged at the bottom of the central fountain, so shown here. The five coloured towers at the top of the panel may symbolize the five forms of lust and the sins against nature: fornication, adultery, incest, sex with minors, and rape. Now, sodomy was a capital offence during this period, and in Bruges, in just 50 years, 90 citizens had been executed for this crime. And in Bosch's time, religious heresy, or betrayal of God, and the unspeakable crime, betrayal of God's creation, were legally one and the same. The Dutch and German words for convicted sodomites, Keter or Ketzer, derive from the heretical Cathars, just as in English, bugger comes from the heretical bogomiles. It was the secular rulers who led the war against sodomy. Defined as a rebellion against God's majesty and thus linked to Satan's original revolt, these crimes were political in kind. The city burning in the right panel depicting hell is Sodom, but Bosch intimates that this darkness, this ultimate unhappy ending, was already present in the Garden of Eden. The hollowed out tree man in hell looks back all the way to Adam, who looks to Eve. Above the figure of God, hidden in a hole in the fountain of life, an owl looks out from the darkness. A trap, and watching Adam's entrapment by Eve. The all-seeing owl also watches us, not with his own eyes, but with the oculus from within which it peers. The black hole occurs at the exact center of Bosch's panel, aligned with God's gaze. So here, with the owl. A diabolical eye constituted by the structure of the painting, it imports into Eden the darkness before creation, that encircling nothing pictured on the exterior of the ensemble shutters, and with it the night of Lucifer's prideful fall. Darkness wins out in the end, when a humanoid owl, the tree man, gazes back from the night of hell. The deathly tree man is also a counterpart to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Eden. So while Bosch's triptych can be seen as a morality tale about desire, lust, and the idolatry of the self turned away from God, his overt Christocentric paintings, such as Ecce Homo or the Prado Adoration of the Magi from around 1510, show explicitly humanity's utter contempt and hatred for Christ. Bosch's pessimistic and rather nihilist oeuvre shows us a world turned away from God and its infernal consequences. Brueghel, on the other hand, shows us humanity's nonchalant indifference to God, who has, as it were, left the scene in Brueghel's paintings. We have to look closely to find God in Brueghel. The threatened violence is somehow more real in Brueghel in contrast to the infernal horrorscapes of Bosch. This is seen, for example, in this 1563, The Adoration of the Kings in the Snow, where a group of huddled mercenaries stand around a bridge waiting for the three kings to pay homage to the Christ child, who is barely noticeable with Joseph and Mary in a snow-covered hovel on the far left. The snow intensifies the obscurity. The viewer has to search to find Christ. So the three kings here. This tells a story about the world's indifference. In a gesture of sublime irony, the painter makes the biblical epiphany, Christ's singular world-changing coming to light, almost disappear. Tiny at the lower left of this painting, the sacred actors recede into the shadows of the ruined stables. Here, the eclipse of biblical narrative is not some career choice Brueghel has made. It is rather the true state of things, both back then when Christ was born, homeless and uncelebrated, in a stable in Bethlehem, and now in the painter's age, in the Flemish life world Brueghel intimately knows and to which he projects Christ's birth. The painter shows what an epiphany would look like to imperfect human eyes, an event obscure to perception and overwhelmed by the demands nature and circumstance put on us. While the three kings gather around Christ, their entourage loiters, armed, idle, and potentially dangerous. The world's indifference to Christ is nowhere more fully shown than in Brueghel's Christ Carrying the Cross from 1564. Painted for his patron, the Antwerp merchant Nicolaas Jongelink. It is the largest landscape painting in early Netherlandish art and Brueghel's largest panel. Mounted Habsburg mercenaries dressed in red lead Christ to his place of execution at Golgotha on the upper right, where the place for the cross is that moment being dug in the ground. A circle of spectators have already eagerly gathered at the place of execution. A breaking or execution wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, with the carrion bird perched on its rim, sits atop the tree of death on the far right, a contemporary instrument of execution used to suppress heretics in the Netherlands. Like a Where's Wally tableau, the viewer has to look to find Christ in the center of the panel, who has fallen beneath his cross. So here. Dressed in a blue tunic, Christ stares down at the ground, but the crowd in the picture do not look at him. In the extended 2011 film meditation of the painting, The Mill and the Cross, directed by Lech Majewski, the viewer never gets to see the face of Christ, who represents faceless victims everywhere. In the painting, the crowd's attention is diverted, looking at Simon of Cyrene, who is unwillingly dragged from his wife to assist with the carrying of the cross. A diabolical-looking mercenary atop a horse barks orders while others in the crowd look to the two thieves with their confessors in the wagon. So, Simon being dragged from his wife. There's the mercenary here, and then you have the two thieves in the cart with their confessors. The procession moves through a landscape scarred and worn down through countless ages of mimetic violence and contagion. Brueghel shows us the human procession through time from the circle of life on the far left, the walled city, far left, to the circle of death on the far right, Golgotha. Like the axis of a wheel, the painting turns around the jagged pinnacle of rock, atop which stands an unlikely windmill perched on a circular platform with the miller barely visible, about to set the cruciform sails in motion. God the Father is a miller about to grind the bread of life. The earth at the base of the rock has been worn away with time. Unlike Bosch, Brueghel does not place God the Father in a little bubble on the margin of the painting, but hides him like he hides Christ. We find the vagrant peddler or wayfarer that we've met in Bosch's The Haywain, or the peddler, in the foreground with his back to us. So here. And adjacent to him we find a little group of mourners, the Virgin Mary, St. John, and the two Marys. Even they don't look at Christ, but look downwards. They are weeping for us, for humanity, not for Christ. Love of the world causes everyone to overlook Christ. Yet whereas Bosch aligned his painting's perspective with divine judgment, Brueghel places it inside the worldly parade. Whereas in Bosch people lust for life but get unwittingly trapped in death, here people strain to get a good look at death. Watching someone die seems the best thing going. With the crowd being active spectators in this macabre dance of death, the painting poses the question to each one of us, what would you do? In this painting, Brueghel makes human history the forming and deforming force. Cruelty and suffering in their longest duration have shaped the very ground of nature, carving a sheer abyss between the summit where the windmill stands and the land stretching forth to the sea. The soil exhibits the micro-effects of successive episodes of this history. In the film version, the randomness of mimetic violence is shown in how the mercenaries run down a peasant dressed in red, encircle and beat him, and then hoist him on the breaking wheel to let birds rip out his eyes. The peasant starts to run when he sees the mounted horsemen approach, but the audience never finds out what his crime was. At the end of the film, after Christ's crucifixion, we see the same soldiers target another man also dressed in red, again for no apparent reason. We presume the men are hunted down because they're heretics, they're being hunted by the Spanish mercenaries, as Christ is depicted as a reformer who dared to say that he would destroy the cathedral and rebuild it in 3 days. This clip from the film.
My painting will have to tell many stories. It should be large enough to hold everything. Everything, all the people. It must be on I will work like the spider I saw this morning, building its web. First, it finds an anchoring point. Here, the heart of my web. In most paintings, God is shown parting the clouds, looking down on the world in his pleasure. In my painting, the miller life and destiny.
I'm a citizen of Antwerp, collector of paintings. I believe, and many others in this magnificent city also believe, that good men of all confessions can come together in peace and good understanding. And that is not the opinion of the King of Spain, who is also our king, alas. It is now his pleasure that all heritage should be put to death.
Nothing's going to happen.
Mayuski brilliantly captures Brueghel's moral pessimism as the film ends with children playing in sunlight the day after the crucifixion and peasants dancing in a circle to festive pipe music. Life goes on as normal. There is no resurrection in either Bosch or Brueghel's paintings. Life continues and the circle of mimetic violence continues. Whether it is in his conversion of Paul from 1567, my personal favourite of Brueghel's paintings, where the viewer has to search for Saul falling off his horse in the midst of an alpine pass, with the storm gathering in the distance, surrounded by mounted armour-plated soldiers, so shown here. Or Icarus falling from the sky into the sea, ignored by everyone. So shown here. You just see his legs. Brueghel shows these historical and epoch-making events from the indifferent view of humankind. History for Brueghel consists not in great events or in world-changing actions. Nothing changes, and heroic action, such as Icarus's flight, makes no impression on the world. God does not change history either. Cruelty is the same in Antwerp and Brussels as it was before Christ's saving death in Jerusalem. Brueghel's topicality, his emphasis on the historical conditions of his own here and now, is less a critique of the times than a portrait of time in its long duration, where everything remains the same. And the poet W.H. Auden captured this well in his poem, The Musée des Beaux-Arts, concerning the Brueghel paintings, The Fall of Icarus, and the census at Bethlehem in Brussels. About suffering they were never wrong, the old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who do not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Brueghel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to do on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. The final painting by Brueghel I want to consider is the Vienna Tower of Babel from 1563, also commissioned by Jungelink, also in Vienna. Now, like the Christ carrying the cross, the Tower of Babel also uses a rock pinnacle as a central structuring motif, perhaps symbolic of the church. And it's been suggested that both this painting and Christ carrying the cross should be read as a pair. The inspiration here is from Genesis 11 and the building of the Tower of Babel by Nimrod, the king in the left foreground of the painting, to whom the builders prostrate themselves. It's incidentally, we might add, the same king of France we met earlier in Bosch's The Hay Wain. So shown here, he's exactly the same regalia as in Bosch's Hay Wain. Perhaps an ancestor. Nimrod looks older, but he's wearing the same regalia. In the Genesis story of the tower, the inhabitants of the earth who speak one language moved into the plain of Shinar after the catastrophe of the flood. God scrambles their language, their plans, and scatters them over the whole face of the earth, not because he is jealous of their achievements, but because in their pride they seek to create security without God. With a wry irony, Brueghel shows the vanity of human plans and ambitions as the top of the tower just breaks the clouds. Built in an anti-clockwise circle, again symbolic of diabolical, the towering edifice is structurally unstable. It is only a matter of time, Brueghel hints, before it will collapse and demolish the fragile Babylon below. Babylon was, of course, the early Christian code word for Rome, and the distinctly Roman Colosseum-looking structure may be an oblique reference to the Roman Catholic Church. Apart from the architectural similarities with the Colosseum that may point towards a Roman reference point, in the smaller Rotterdam Tower of Babel, painted around 1565, Brueghel painted in tiny miniature on the fourth turn of the tower's spiral a red processional baldachin surrounded by crowds, the Pope and his entourage. Now, so just here. As Kerner notes, the size of this detail is as important as its message. Almost too small to see, it hides inside the picture like a private secret. The wars of religion taught the wisdom of dissemblance. People concealed their religious beliefs both to survive and because they held true faith to be invisible and to transcend warring fates. Available only to the painter's owner, the detail poses little danger. Spotted by an informer, it could be denied. Are we certain it's the Pope? But by its miniature portrayal, Brueghel sends instruction to his viewer to look closely and critically. According to Josephus, it was the tyrant Nimrod, the tower's builder, who transferred to himself the people's fear of God and persuaded them to build a tower in defiance of God. For Brueghel, that pride caused tyranny, and that tyranny was rebellion punishable by God, were timely lessons in 1563, as Philip II of Spain attempted to assert absolute Habsburg rule over the Netherlands. In Brueghel's paintings, it is the Catholic Habsburgs and their Spanish mercenaries who are the tyrants. For his humanist clientele, Brueghel shows us a world without God, a world that is indifferent to human suffering. In this way, he was the first truly modern secular artist. From a theological perspective, both the works of Bosch and Brueghel are deficient. Theirs is a theology of despair and indifference that needs to be understood within the context of the apocalyptic eschatology of their time and the turmoil caused by the Reformation and the wars of religion. While we may marvel at their brilliance as moralists and intricate storytellers, There is nothing redemptive about the work of both artists. There is no sense of Christian hope or of resurrection. Both share a moral pessimism that is late medieval and apocalyptic in its tone. Bosch gives us the big picture, a divine eschatological perspective where very few people will be saved. Brueghel gives us the wide-angled human perspective, a world without God, where mimetic violence and contagion continue unabated despite Christ's sacrifice. The only thing to do is to dance beneath the gallows in defiance, as shown here in Brueghel's last known painting from 1568, a year before he died, the magpie on the gallows, which he bequeathed to his wife. So showing a peasant couple dancing beneath the gallows. Brueghel's humanist clientele and paintings also bear out Max Weber's theories in showing the profound shift that came about at this time towards a more materialist, this-worldly and individualistic worldview that would birth the modern world. As summarized by the historian Carlos Era, Protestants now face the divine tribunal and their eternal destiny alone at the end of this life. Gone was the communion of saints, and gone too was the chance to earn salvation in the world to come for eternity. This life and this world, then, became the sole focus of religion, as did the individual over the community and even over all of history itself. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber argued that Protestants gained an economic edge over Catholics because they shifted their attention away from the hereafter to the here and now, developing a piety he dubbed this worldly asceticism. Weber also argued that the Reformation was one giant step in the long, arduous process of the elimination of magic from the world. And in the paintings of Bosch and Brueghel that bridge the Reformation period, we can trace to some extent these tectonic theological rifts that would have long-lasting cultural consequences and shape our contemporary world. Thank you.
Dr. O'Hara has agreed to answer a few questions formally, and then perhaps we can break for a little snack that Dr. Casella has provided for us, and continue the conversation in less form. I have an opening one. So, I'm not an art historian either, but I'm interested in what is happening in the 15th, 16th centuries in art. And it seems that Catholic art also has a shift towards not simply realism, but the incorporation of ordinary things. And there's a strong trend in later Catholic theology emphasizing the goodness of this shift to depicting ordinary things in which the sacred is not as easily found as other forms of art. But that has a positive emphasis that you find not here. So, and I'm inclined to agree, but what would you say if someone said, these are actually, well, this last photo is a bit of a problem, but some of the other ones are puzzles of faith, and they're communicating the strength you need to be faithful in the modern world, because it's not just laid out for you in sumptuous fashion, but faith requires an active searching, perhaps even something beyond that. It requires a kind of grace and ability to see the sacred. What would you respond to someone who said, oh no, Brueghel and Bosch are actually marvelously faithful, hopeful people?
Yeah, and I suppose it's that kind of detail and kind of puzzles that I think are so appealing, is that the level of detail and intricacy, and they do make you think. Yeah, I like that idea of kind of as a puzzles of faith. Yeah, I think they are, but I don't see their work as kind of hopeful. I think, yeah, in a way, Bosch is a lot more late medieval, I would say, and of course, you know, with the tragedy of the Black Death, and then with Brueghel, the wars of religion. I think there is a kind of a pessimism, but I personally find their work quite encouraging. They certainly make you think, and I like that idea of actually puzzles of faith. I think that's a good way to actually look at it. There's another one, Brueghel, of the bird catcher, and this of a man kind of about to walk into a stream, but he's totally unaware, and because he's looking at the bird catcher trying to capture the nest. So in a way that they're very playful, and I think moralists, yeah, and I suppose then to think in terms of their patrons, because you know, most of Bosch ended up in the Prado because of Philip II, and the Habsburgs collected, you know, and then the same with Vienna, with Brueghel, they ended up in the Habsburg collection.
What was that all about? Were they trying to prevent people from seeing the nasty Spanish mercenaries by buying up the art? I don't think, yeah, I don't think so. Although there was, I'm trying to think,
Brueghel has a few ones of the killing of the innocents, and I think they were touched up. Well, one of them was certainly touched up, where it's showing Spanish mercenaries spearing children. And it was painted over into pigs. Now I forget what time that was actually, but it was clearly very critical of you know, of the Habsburgs. But Bosch's patrons appear to have been the kind of Burgundian nobility in Brussels, and then with Brueghel, really it's kind of humanist clientele, like these new merchant class. Yeah, but I like that idea of puzzles of faith. I think that's, yeah. Any other questions, or yeah?
So I noticed that, well, both of these artists produce such beautiful works of art. So they use color, bright colors, they use the nature, they use landscapes, but they're talking about despair and indifference and such, sin and turning away from Christ. What do you think the author or the artist's intent is with the use of beauty in their paintings?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think because of course that's not a view you're going to see in Belgium or the Netherlands, and art historians have said that the discovery of the New World really influenced in terms of this kind of landscape, and because these are kind of fantastical landscapes. But that's, yeah, and in a way they're kind of pastoral, like the I suppose they draw you into the story, don't they, in terms of the beauty, because in a way with the that's a visually very stunning kind of work, and it's very beautiful in a way. But the closer you look, and actually what's kind of going on there, actually makes you kind of think. So it is a puzzle, and the way that he's using like these kind of exotic fruits and And this, again, this element of kind of bizarreness, particularly with the, what's going on with the musical instruments there, for example. But I think that's a great question, and particularly, this reminds me a lot of Lucas Cranach, particularly the Adam and Eve, Cranach's Adam and Eve paintings. But I suppose my sense would be it kind of draws us into the story, yeah. And also, I should say that is it this one that I think it's this one, yeah. So, of course, these were all very elite paintings, and they would have been commissioned. We think this was commissioned by one of the counts of Nassau, but in their kind of private palace. But this guy had a huge bed where you basically have, it was like a massive bed, and this would have been in the gallery. So again, it's a kind of a private world, kind of a closed world, and quite elite. So we don't really know, yeah. And particularly with this, if it was one of these counts, he was quite a womanizer. So again, yeah, it's part of the enigma about it. Yeah, but I think that's a great way to get into it in terms of the beauty, and yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
So since we have come back to this painting, I was wondering how, what led you to find out about some of the symbolism pattern, because they seem quite obscure. For example, you mentioned that the owl is always symbol for evil in the Bosch paintings. And since I'm like, is that just something that was commonly seen in many paintings that era, or like how would you?
Yeah, like I've been quite influenced by Joseph Leo Kerner, Bosch and Brueghel, From Enemy Painting to Everyday Life, which was published in 2016. So he's one of the foremost kind of art historian. I'm not an art historian, but I found his kind of interpretation very, very compelling, and particularly in terms of so Bosch was influenced by late medieval manuscripts and kind of manuscript illumination. But this is something that art historians have studied in terms of the different symbols and meanings. But also with Brueghel, Brueghel used a lot of kind of like Dutch proverbs that were kind of popular in his days, that some of the meanings would be lost to us, like dancing at the foot of the gallows. That was a kind of a Dutch proverb. Yeah. So, but I would say Kerner's book influenced me there in terms of the interpretation. Yeah. Did you?
Yes. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very, very rich.
Thank you.
But I was wondering if you could expand upon the theory of mimetics you were talking about, and precisely why that particular theory is the best way to interpret these two painters specifically.
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, like it's one way of kind of approaching. Girard is kind of being used now to. First of all, Girard was primarily a literature scholar, and he noticed that in terms of great novelists, that's where he kind of came up with his theory of mimetic desire. So an example would be Don Quixote and Cervantes, that that Don Quixote, he's living past the age of chivalry, but he's reading these tales of knights, and he has a model who he wants to imitate, but then he goes chasing windmills. I found Girard's theory just an interesting kind of, and I only touched upon it, but kind of an interesting angle to apply to these. As far as I know, Girardian theory has not been applied to Bosch or Brueghel. So I think that's what I was trying to do. But in terms of if we think about, I suppose, because I think Bosch is about misdirected desire, and essentially Girard is all about desire. It's essentially about desire. So I thought that would be a good angle in, or at least a kind of, with a lot of these theories, they're only they're really a kind of framework to think with. Yeah. So it's not a hard and fast. But I think in terms of some of the questions, I found Girard quite interesting. Yeah.
I was very interested in a detail of the last painting.
Yeah.
The
gallows.
The gallows. Yeah. So I noticed there was like a almost MC-esque like twist of the gallows.
Oh yeah.
I'm wondering if that's another reference to the demonic counterclockwise twist in his paintings, or
oh yeah.
It interested me.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that actually. Yeah, that is yeah. It's a weird perspective actually, isn't it? Yeah. I hadn't.
It really threw me off.
Yeah. No. Good point. Good point. And then we have, I don't know if it's some kind of bird sitting on the top of it there. Yeah. And of course, Brueghel's probably best known for his kind of peasant paintings, like the peasant's wedding and kind of depicting peasant life. Again, very, very new, very different to kind of in terms of what went before him. Yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned that the perspective of these two artists has influenced modern thought. Could you elaborate on how it has does it affect modern art or theology or both? Could you elaborate on that?
Influence modern thought?
Yeah, it seems like you were saying that what they brought to the table as far as theological implications has affected.
No, I think what I was saying is more that looking that these an example of kind of like what Hausinger was doing for the 15th century, and looking at Van Eyck, we can look at Bosch and Bruegel as kind of bridge figures between the late medieval and the Renaissance, at a time of real change in terms of the Reformation and then the kind of consequences that came out of that. No, I was more thinking about what Carlos Eyre writes about Max Weber, that one of the theories is that the Reformation was a further step in the kind of elimination of magic, or a kind of what he calls the kind of desacralizing of a kind of a worldview, and I suppose we can see that in these paintings. So Bosch's emphasis on kind of hell and the last things, and then this kind of hidden theology in Bruegel. So it's more reflective of this kind of cultural change or zeitgeist in a way. But how it's relevant to or how it kind of influenced contemporary or I'm not sure. Thank you.
One more question, and then we can continue informally.
Okay.
Sure. Again, thank you for the presentation. In some of these more despairing paintings, like the triptych of the Pleasure Garden, I forget the exact name. I'm definitely understanding the mimetic desire cycle of the despairing, nothing, no end. I was wondering, were you trying to make a connection with then the anti-scapegoat kind of being God being completely absent in those paintings, and is there some kind of implication there?
Like God is being absent in the panel?
Sorry.
Can you say that?
Sure. So when you touched up on the scapegoat idea of the mimetic desire, sure. This painting. So is the idea that is just completely absent, and that's why you have the circle, or is he trying to make a point because it's not there?
Yeah, I think so. That it's like the fact that it's just on, it's just on desire. There's no children there. It's and again, it's kind of, there's a lot of symbols and fruit, but it's actually, there's no children, so it's kind of fruitless. And yeah, God is essentially not there. But I haven't really looked in terms of, I just gave the scapegoating as an example of kind of Girard's theory. And that's one element of his theory, that what happens when this kind of mimetic rivalry escalates, right? It escalates, and then you choose an outsider to take that focus off, because the rivalry has escalated to such a point where it's kind of toxic. And then you need to kind of deflect that onto, and by say killing that victim or a minority group, let's say, that leads to a temporary de-escalation in terms of mimetic. But because it's cyclical, it's going to start again, right? Because you're unconscious of it. So that's why he says it's kind of demonic, that Christ's sacrifice in a way breaks that cycle. So it's what he gives the example of Christ and the adulterous woman, where Christ does not return the gaze of the accusers. So he looks down, he avoids the gaze. He does not, but he writes on the ground, and so he does not engage in terms of, but he de-escalates, but he then becomes, in a way, that the scapegoat who's driven out and is ultimately killed. Yeah.
Thank you very much.